On this episode of BiCurean, we are joined by Sarah Wells, a community advocate for cooperative housing. We learned about the history of zoning codes and recent changes to the Denver city housing laws.
Hi, I'm Eric,
And I'm Aisla.
and together we are the hosts of the BiCurean podcast.
BiCurean is our answer to the polarizing culture we live in.
Tired of feeling under siege and looking for ways to get involved? Then come be a part of a different way of thinking.
Everything from politics to geek culture to current events that polarize us as a society, we explore multiple ways of looking at things.
Welcome to the show.
Yes, we're very excited to be here tonight.
So, it seems to me that we've run into this situation over and over, and that's actually how we met the friend of ours that's our guest tonight. But the necessity of things like cohabitation and just real estate in general in a world where, ironically, during the show prep, I used the term kind of represents the literal death of the nuclear family as opposed to the philosophical death, people needing to group purchase houses and stuff. And it did, it's a thought that I've had before. And we realized we have a friend who actually has some big news that she wants to share on the show. So we're pleased to welcome Sarah Wells to the show tonight. Sarah, why don't you introduce yourself and tell people who you are and what you do?
Sure. So thanks for having me. I'm Sarah Wells. I'm a cooperative real estate developer and advocate for community housing. I started a housing cooperative in the Capitol Hill neighborhood of Denver in 2015. And that made me, kind of galvanized me around creating community and providing access to ownership. So I'm really passionate about finding different ways for people to stabilize their access to housing, and also passionate about the benefits of living in community. And most recently, I served on the group living advisory council that changed the rules for the city of Denver relating to how many unrelated people are allowed to live together, and learned a whole heck of a lot about outdated zoning codes and how they affect our housing.
So
Yeah, it's a fascinating subject. So before we jump in, though,
yes,
you have a question?
I do have a question. We have started this little tradition of a little icebreaker. So are you ready for this? So how would you define BiCurean?
I listened to a couple episodes and I knew you were going to ask me this. So I feel, I'm glad that I did. I feel prepared. I think that BiCurean to me means an openness to finding common ground. Because we so often think that the answer to our problems exists in a dichotomy where one is mutually exclusive of the other. And I think actually the solution typically is more inclusive. And so that's my take on BiCurean.
That is totally our philosophy. So I'm glad that resonated with you. It seems like a far cry to get anyone thinking inclusively these days, but we're going to keep fighting the good fight.
Well, and one of the things that I'm always thinking about this because it's this passion for me. And I realize that sometimes we have difficulty attracting people as listeners because we don't do those more sensational tactics, because we have content that people tend to enjoy. However, that splash that you get from sensationalism or whatnot is not our style, so we're not doing it. And I had this tagline come into my head is we're the anti-clickbait. Instead of taking a molehill and mountaining it, we like to take a mountain and make it scalable. And so just that, you're not going to listen to us, hopefully, and feel agitated. You're going to listen to us and feel, informed or grounded or thoughtful. But that's also why one of my really close friends is I can't listen to you in the morning when I'm getting ready for work, because if I miss 30 seconds, I have no idea what's going on. There's too much
Right.
information in the conversation.
An invitation to a gradual paradigm shift.
There you go.
What you're offering.
I love it.
Yes, especially given that the gradual paradigm shift has been away from what we've been going towards lately, but that'll be the topic of another show. So, no, I think this is a fascinating thing, and we were talking about a little bit in show prep that I mention on here all the time. I work for a company that, even though I live in Denver, is based out of Palo Alto. So I have a lot of coworkers that live in the Bay Area. I can't even imagine the idea of not having cohabitation amongst my coworkers that are not, C-suite people. They need to live four to a house in order to afford rent, much less purchasing. It's just impossible when, the cheapest, 2-bedroom house bungalow, in the middle of the peninsula somewhere is going to cost you $1.2 million. But for that reason, it's something that's been a part of my life. And I was actually surprised. I did not know that Denver had any restrictions on the number of people that could live together. I kind of thought that fell under, like short of zoning issues. I mean, you can have a goat and 2 chickens in Denver, but you can't live with your friend.
Yeah. So the rule of unrelated adults actually is consistent in a lot of cities across the United States. It's not just in Colorado. California is actually the only state that doesn't have relationship built into the zoning code. Huh. So this is a fight that exists in lots of cities across the country, primarily because when zoning was invented pre-World War II, there wasn't zoning code. And then after World War II, there was a group of men who created a lot of different codes for how cities should be built, and then sold that book of codes to a lot of other cities who then implemented them. And then those cities have gradually changed those codes over the last several decades, some with sweeping changes like California, where they just eliminated it altogether, and some in these like very minute changes that happened over time.
Yeah. I think a lot of people would be very surprised to know the history of codes, whether it's food safety codes, zoning codes, most of this stuff. It's pretty much usually based on a best practice at the time. I worked in food safety, so I'm very familiar with the fact that like the food safety code that everybody thinks exists and is frequently updated, it is maybe every 5 years, right? But depending on your jurisdiction, your county or whatever, they might still be on the original 1976 food code, which has some dated science. Mm-hmm. So I think it's sounding to me like zoning suffers from kind of the same antiquated practices in some ways.
I think that's true if those food safety practices are rooted in racism, classism, and homophobia.
Not as much. They're not too much of a fan of the bugs that make you sick, but not necessarily done in a way. It is interesting, though, to that point. Most cities and counties just simply don't know what to do with your average Asian market because there's nothing on paper or scientifically that looks good about dropping a whole bunch of ducks in the same marinade that you've used for a month at room temperature. And you just keep on cycling the ducks through. And for some reason, like the magic of Chinese science, it does not ever make anybody sick, but there's like nothing about it in the food code. So they don't often know. Like some people, they'll be really harsh on Chinese restaurants and stuff that'll prepare, like Peking duck and things like that are marinated that way. But you said that and it reminded me, there is like that one actual weird cultural thing there. I would imagine the zoning laws are probably similar culturally.
Yeah, I mean, the occupancy laws around blood relationship are really restricted to single family homes primarily. And the idea was that we can protect neighborhoods by making it so that only singular families are allowed to live per house. And that will prevent sort of unsavory characters from occupying our neighborhoods, whether that is like an immigrant family, multiple families living together, whether that is like an LGBT family living there. And so, or just people who want to live together out of affordability necessity. And so those codes were really meant to, maintain the character of a place and rooted in protecting, primarily white upper middle class people who already had a foothold in their neighborhoods.
Yeah, I can see that. I have a small experience of the history of zoning in Boulder. I worked on a project when I was out there, and one of the things that they did to have Boulder start out, you probably know this, as a wealthy community is instead of giving the plots of land that were free at the time from the government, stolen but still free for settlers to go live on, they charged $1,000 for the plots. And so Boulder, right from the beginning, and they also had like building codes, like they required a stone chimney and certain things like that. And those were all primarily intended to create a situation where only wealthy people were able to get a plot and build a home, so that there was a certain in 1992, the head of the Ku Klux Klan came to Boulder and asked how they had created such a perfect white utopia. It's in a newspaper article if you ever want me to share that with you. So I mean, it's like, but I think some of it comes from that like colonial and is wealth driven foundation. So I can see how that could have been expanded upon or continued. And I'm curious to hear a little bit more about what you consider to be maybe a success around the changes and anything. I know you said there's more work to do. I know when I read the article, I was fascinated that like over 1,000 people commented and about half for either side. I don't even understand why anybody would oppose that change. So I'm curious about that as well.
Sure. So to provide a little context on the issue, Denver's zoning code previously only allowed up to two unrelated people in a single family house, regardless of size. And anyone else that lived there needed to be blood related. So two married people, as an example, didn't count as related. That would be the maximum two that were allowed in the place. And 3 years ago, the city convened a group to create a new version of the code to more clearly align with how people were actually living, and also as a mechanism to create more options for affordability that the city could potentially support, right? Because the city can't build community housing if it goes against zoning code that the city has. So, we set out to figure out where those codes came from, and also to create a code that would be more inclusive. And that group, the very first thing that we agreed on was that blood relationship shouldn't exist in the zoning code. And we made a recommendation to council to increase the number of people based on the size of the home. Very logical, which is also consistent with building and fire code, right? Because this is an issue of safety. And so how do we prevent overcrowding? How do we prevent these things that people are afraid of? And for us, it should be a sliding number. And when we presented that to the public, there was some very organized opposition that spread a lot of fear around how property values would decrease if the homes in their neighborhoods were overoccupied, and how there would just be parties all the time and trash everywhere, and people who are living together in larger numbers or outside of their families would inherently be less responsible, which, for us who live in community know that's not true. I'm actually held much more accountable for my actions living in community than I would be living alone. But when council got a hold of the draft, they actually changed the number from 2 unrelated people to 5 unrelated people, which goes a long way in protecting a lot of roommates, but does not legalize most of the formal cooperative houses in the city. So a lot of us who stuck our necks out to say, hey, look at me, we're a responsible version of group living, are actually not protected under this law change, and so remain vulnerable to displacement today.
What are the consequences? Like what is the...
Well, yeah, I was going to say, how is this even enforced? Is it enforced? I mean, I know plenty of people that have rented a room or various different situations of just groups of people co-renting a house together. I mean,
yeah.
I co-rented a house with somebody back in 2000. Now, I was outside of Denver, and I don't know. Now we get into the different counties, and those might be all different. But, yeah, what's enforcement and all of that even look like?
Yeah, so this is where it gets, like, kind of sticky and kind of like, come at me, city. But the city is not qualified or empowered to do blood tests on people, and so oftentimes, kind of what we have told people internally with other community houses is to claim relationships to one another, and so enforcement often means that people who don't own their property they get pressure from their landlord to end their lease, and it's typically renters who are displaced. Owners who are brought into the eye of the city under these rules, there's a fine process, and the city also tries to bring you into compliance by changing who lives there. But it's really unclear what the enforcement mechanisms are aside from a fine structure. But they're not going to jail anybody for living together.
Gotcha. It's also interesting because it's not so much the consequences as the assertion of invalidity. It does have an effect, and as you said, it also means that the kinds of houses or structures that get built are houses and structures that have to follow or prioritize this idea of as you said, implementing these zoning codes that have to do with keeping the unsavory people out, instead of really looking at what creates an intentional community, what creates a thriving, sustainable, functioning community. So it's really interesting because even if it's not necessarily an enforcement or a consequence for a particular person, it does mean that the city itself is going to continue to live and express that as their value, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And so I think, what made headlines last week was the passage of this group living change and the change to 5 people. But I think the actual kind of secret win in the changes that were made in zoning was the expansion of what related means. So as I mentioned, married did not make you related under the old code, and the new code language actually says people who are related by marriage, domestic partnership, or committed partnership. And there's no definition of committed partnership. So, I share food and cook meals and share finances with the people who live with me. Is that a committed partnership? I think so, right?
Yeah, that's a big gray area, right?
Right. And so I think that's the secret, more expansive win that we have that wasn't really clear to all the not in my backyard folks who came out with a lot of hateful things to say.
Well, as with most state and local laws, I mean, enforcement becomes a big issue, as does interpretation. I mean, yeah. So now I don't even have to claim that my roommate's my sister. I could just say I'm in a relationship. So I guess
suddenly all of their crazy sex commune ideas are true. I'm just in a relationship with everyone that I live with.
Well, but I mean, and now we're getting into broader, like you said, they didn't define what a committed relationship means. Could be completely platonic, non-sexual, but equally important towards your goals of home ownership and such. So, well, and you mentioned, and I'm curious because that, I mean, sounds like there's no real gray area in just being able to override, this is just a non-issue for most people, but you said that there was some concerning things that would affect you, how is this not covering that?
I suppose what it could mean is that is a challenge on enforcement, and a question of what's the burden of proof of a committed relationship. And so there's, what I would have liked as a very clear win is our zoning code to not have reference to blood relationship anymore, and also for us to have a clear pathway to compliance. And now it's stuck in a gray area, and we still have blood relationship in the code.
No, I thought what you said just made a lot of sense to me in terms of make it based on objective analysis. How much square footage, how many exits, how many rooms, whatever that is, for safe standards in terms of overcrowding or whatever rather than making it about, because it's interesting to me, because as a country that seems to want to value like freedom and privacy, that's an awful lot of interference into what you're doing in the privacy of your own home. When, really the thing that makes sense is to say, okay, this is like, I think with renters, it's a little bit different. Like you don't want a landlord to put 35 people in a 2-bedroom house because they can make a lot of money.
Mhm.
Like that's exploitation, right? I don't know. But so I don't get it. I mean, I get it because it's our puritanical roots, but it just doesn't make any sense when it comes to the things we talk about valuing.
Yeah, there's actually been what I think is an interesting allyship in this fight, which is the like democratic socialists, leftists in Denver that are wanting to start co-ops, really being in line with the libertarians that are really care about property rights and the government not telling them who can live in their house.
Yeah, that is cool.
I've found a few places where that overlap happens, interestingly, because ultimately when you're talking about personal freedoms, it really just depends on what the topic is. Being pro-choice is about a personal freedom. You'd think that the libertarians, in fact, most libertarians I've talked to tend to be pro-choice because, again, it's about your personal rights not being infringed. So interesting overlap there. But yeah, I have had friends, and you mentioned it from a cultural standpoint, especially classist and racist. I had a friend from Trinidad, and she was just floored, living in this country that we didn't have basically, multi-generational housing and cohabitation. It's just such a part of other cultures that, because, I mean, not only we have our puritanical thing, then we have the 1950s nuclear family thing. And what, what I was kind of mentioning at the beginning of the show, the idea of the nuclear family continues to just be eroded in various different ways. Yeah, how have you seen that kind of affecting all of this? Is the pushback coming from these traditionalist 1950s housewives stuck 60 years later?
I mean, I do think a lot of the opposition is coming from people who were raised with those mid-century values. A lot of like, this is not what I was promised rhetoric is kind of what came out of those, those folks. I would say that with my work in cooperatives and in community housing, it is about affordability, but it's really about creating a new, making a different choice in designing your life to have more people who support you around you on a daily basis. My partner and I have an 18-month-old, and I honestly can't imagine living alone with the two of them at this point. I don't want to, right? And that's an idea that is radical to the notion of nuclear family. The idea that I would want 5 other adults around me participating in child rearing is not the 1950s dream, but the 1950s dream is isolating and expensive and less possible.
Well, I feel like the non-nuclear family concept is really only about a decade younger. I mean, it was really the hippie movement in the 60s, late 60s and 70s. It was almost the anti-1950s nuclear family thing, casual group. I mean, the concept of the parents being the village, that came from the writings of, the hippies in the mid 60s. So it's not like any idea is particularly newer or older. It just depends, I guess, on what sort of thing people have clung to.
I think that's true. I think that the hippie and commune movement, though, is I at least receive a lot of feedback from more traditional folks that's like not serious, right? That like it's a fleeting concept that was not successful. And I think that what we're seeing with community housing and people buying property together to create a sense of community and also to have access and a foothold of wealth building in the United States does indicate a seriousness, and is something that can be treated with a lot of respect, understanding that the other way is just not like nurturing, really.
I think, yeah, I'm just trying to like contemplate conceptually like the different circumstances that people could end up in. But I mean, mostly it just comes down, like you said. I mean, if you've got a group of people that are consenting adults that want to live together and do a more interactive community. What's interesting is the concept, as you were talking about that, of COVID. Hard to get it off our minds right now, but like potting up, I mean, I'm pretty sure it saved me, both from a social aspect, from how we were able to, we kind of shared with another household that we could interact, but we were just totally locked down together. So it was like one household, except there was two buildings, but none of us were going to work or anything. So it really helped. And I'm wondering if COVID's not going to, I mean, it changed how people work. Like remote work is now a normal thing for huge companies and small companies. And I'm wondering if it's going to make people think about like how their, more isolated living can interact with, a group of people versus, going home to your apartment alone. And there's alone and social, or, husband and wife and social. Any thoughts? Have you seen anything? I mean, you've been working probably selling and dealing in real estate this whole time too.
Yeah, I have. Real estate's been wild since COVID. I didn't really think that people would take a lot of like this. We're kind of on the edge of all this economic uncertainty. I didn't think that would be a time when people would make significant financial decisions, but I was wrong. So I've actually helped a lot of people buy larger properties since COVID because of a need for more space, and helped a handful of folks purchase houses that will be community houses. And there have been a few articles that have come out recently that are pointing to people wanting to create additional community inside of their homes as a result of COVID, because they're realizing just how isolating it can be once the outside world gets cut off, right? So how do you create that community in the inside world?
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that I really appreciated about your history, you're a real estate agent, and your business partner has been, if I remember correctly, leveraging the ability to purchase a home or helping artists leverage the ability to purchase a home to be able to have more time and space for their art. And that's part of how you guys came together, because you had a passion for co-housing. I'd love to just hear a little bit more about kind of your thoughts on the ways in which, you touched on wealth building, and for me also like quality of life, like for someone that wants to do art and maybe work part-time job. It sounds like that was maybe something that she helped to create. And what else do you see as if we change the way we think about housing, think of it more as a tool or a part of our quality of life in a larger sense? What do you see as the possibilities for people?
Yeah, I think so. A lot of what I see when I'm helping small groups purchase property together is this idea of what is available for them as a group is so much greater and easier to handle than what would be available to them individually, right? You might have each individually, they might only be able to afford renting a place, or they might be able to afford the smallest condo, and it would be a really significant financial stretch for them. Or they can purchase something together and then not be at the very top of their housing payment every month, have some kind of sense of community, and be able to afford more space that they have, where they have private space and can also share together. And what that does is create less pressure every month on making that one giant mortgage payment, because you're not qualifying for people for loans where individually it's at the very edge of what they can afford, which often is what happens, right? And you're also having a diversity of income so that if one of you loses a job, there's support from others, right? So there's less risk of losing housing because you have more people who are contributing to that. And that creates also opportunities for people to be able to save or to be able to move to a different job without fear of losing housing in the immediate term. And so it is, I think, applying the concept of mutual aid to a housing lens, whether it's something that you want to do in the long term or something that you want to commit to in the short term, has a huge amount of benefit, right? I have clients that buy a house together and the agreement is that they're going to hold it for 3 years and then sell it. I helped these two gals. They each came to the table with $5,000 and then 3 years later sold their house and each walked away with $40,000. And they wouldn't have been able to do that had they been operating alone.
Right.
I have like 3 questions. I'll just pop down. I'll start in order. First one. How have you found financing to work in that situation? I mean, I can just think I've been a homeowner since 2003 and bought 2 houses in that time. And I know that I know the first one, my wife was like top on the list for the financing. And then I was, the top on the list the second time just due to our shifting, job status and stuff. How do multiple people get on a loan like that?
There actually aren't limits to how many people can be on a conventional mortgage loan.
Really?
Really?
I guess I thought usually when, we're talking code here and all of that kind of thing, and that's, there's always ways around that, but banks don't usually are not usually that flexible about things. Like you got to promise your firstborn to get a mortgage most of the time, especially a conventional loan.
So I will say that I have particular lenders that I work with that are more familiar with community housing and are therefore like much more game to work with buyers and qualify them in a group. But the crux of it is there are no restrictions to the number of people that are legally allowed to be on a mortgage.
Makes sense. Which actually kind of segues to my next question. You work with lenders and that sort of thing. How do you usually, like, what kind of things do you look for when a couple comes to you and says, we'd like to cohabitate with this other couple? Like, I've looked through MLS. I like looking at MLS listings. I like seeing what the neighborhood around me is doing price wise and all of that. But when you approach this, like what kinds of things do you look for? If I was a potential buyer and like, oh yeah, we're a couple who would like to cohabitate with another couple, show us a property. What do you look for?
Well, usually I ask a lot of questions about what their needs are and what their lifestyle is, and then try to match if what they're telling me they want to see matches with what they have told me their lifestyle is. And then when we are looking at properties, depending on how together or how separate those groups want to be, typically I walk people through changes that can be made to a property to retrofit it to be more like apartment style versus like the standard single family home that only has one kitchen. It's interesting, especially in Denver. Lots of houses that were built in the 50s and 60s have bar setups in the basement that have a wet bar and a countertop. And so those spaces are actually really easy to turn into secondary kitchens, which gives people a little bit more extra privacy and can convert a space without being really expensive.
I had a question and then I got so interested in listening to what you were saying that it flew right out of my head. I think the question I have is how do folks find each other? Like if there's a couple that comes to you that's like, we want to do co-housing, we're not sure we want to do like a large or a single person. If someone comes to you, but they're one income and they don't necessarily want to live in a larger pre-created space, like, do you matchmake or do they or do you encourage them? Are there like message boards? I don't even know. Like, how does someone find that if they don't have that in their personal network?
Sure. So I teach classes about co-buying. And so sometimes people meet each other through those classes. My big plan for 2020 was to create more social events for people to meet each other, which obviously did not turn out the way that we had hoped. And so that is exactly the question that we're really trying to solve as facilitators in this process, is like, can we more intentionally match make people? And, one of the things I talk about a lot, and especially in the class, is one way to do it is to find the people first, right? And then those people find a building together. And another way to do it is to do the building first, and then to invite the people to come in and participate. So my partner and I bought our house before we met any of the people who ended up becoming members of the co-op. Mm-hmm. So if you have the backing or a cosigner or the money to make the building first model happen, that can often be faster. But the people first model of bringing together people and then finding a building can certainly work too.
Thanks.
Yeah, no, I this has been like a really fascinating conversation. I think we live in a world where this is going to become more common, and it's actually interesting to hear you teach classes on it and stuff, because I admit, before our friends a couple of years ago now bought from you, like the idea of it, like I thought, yeah, sure, you could do that, but I didn't really know much about it, and it seems like an interesting thing to actually start. It's no different than like, in a financial advisor advising, here's ways to stretch your money and live better or whatever, so it's kind of another unique approach that people may not think about to get ahead in life.
Yeah, I think, one thing that I see and hear a lot from my clients is like, there's this belief that's ingrained from an early age that we can and should do it alone, that it's like an achievement to purchase a property by yourself and to live by yourself. And I lived alone for 8 years before we moved into our co-op. And I think that the paradigm shift that I've had and that I'm seeing other people come around to is this idea that like the achievement of doing it alone is maybe not actually the best way to do it. And so what does it look like for us to reimagine home ownership and to reimagine the concept of household?
Yeah. Well, and we're going to close up here shortly. I just also want to, it's funny, right? Because I grew up and my mother was sickly. And so I always had that awareness that like sometimes when people get older, they're not functional. And so so I always thought, it would be much better to have a group of people around so you can help each other out in that scenario. And so the alone thing didn't appeal to me in the same way, because I was thought, well, like, who's gonna drive you to your cancer appointment or whatever? Because I like that weird. But I like seeing that there's also other reasons that people come to it, like community. But I guess community is also like being there and taking care of each other when you can't, because you can't always take care of yourself. And I feel like we have this bootstrap, weird hyper individualism focus that ignores reality, which is that none of us actually does it alone. Even the people that say they do, they didn't. Somebody helped them. They're just not acknowledging it. So, at any rate, what is there anything that you would love to like leave our listeners with, or that you are super excited to share?
Well, I guess the one thing that I'll encourage listeners to do, and that I encourage this in my class, is that if you're interested in this idea, the first thing to do is to start talking about it more openly inside of your network and seeing who else might be interested. And that can often create some really interesting conversations about what kind of communities people might want to build together. And if people are in Denver and they want to talk to me, I'm obviously available to do that too.
We'll put all your contact info and any other links that you want us to share for like your classes and stuff. So,
great.
But yeah, no, that'll be great. Like I said, philosophically, I feel like anything that we ever want to do to try to change any paradigms in the world can actually kind of start with this sort of thing. Make a life decision, form your own community, get yourself in good footing and stuff like that. I will tell you, it's something as simple as this. Part of the privilege that I know I enjoy is being financially stable, having a home that I own, that I can afford, that is not a burden, it's actually a blessing and a benefit, has made a huge difference in my ability to worry about other things. And so, you know, this is the kind of thing that I think really is the basic starting point before you got to go out there and protest everything that comes along or whatever. You know, there's things you can do to get yourself in order, and that will make a big difference in the kind of impact you can have. I think home ownership or even a safe and secure renting situation is a massive way to get your life in order. So I'm all for any of that sort of thing.
Agreed.
So on that note, thank you, Sarah. We'll post links and stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah, we appreciate you being on, and we'll definitely just keep in touch on this stuff and see how things go. I'm curious to check in with you at some point about if you notice anything different now that you can even, I guess, more openly talk about these sort of situations and sales and stuff with people.
Yeah, I look forward to many updates of the successful communities.
Awesome.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Well, thank you for being on.
Yeah, I really appreciate you
you.
making time. I know you have a lot going on and a little one, so we really do appreciate it. Thanks for listening. If you have ideas, feedback, thoughts, please find us on social media. We are BiCurean on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Or you can email us at podcast@BiCurean.com.
And if you like what we're doing, please rate us on your listening platform of choice.
Thank you.